Hello, this is Robin Hanson, Associate Professor of Economics at George Mason University, together with...
I'm Jay Hughes. I'm the Associate Provost at University of Massachusetts, Boston, and the Executive Director of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies.
Today we're here to talk about the future of capitalism, rather ambitious topic, which we'll try to flesh out a bit. We'll probably go over some issues in the difference between economics and sociology. We'll talk about social sciences applied to futurism. We'll talk a bit about artificial intelligence and some of the policy challenges there. We'll talk a bit about my new book here. I'm holding up The Age of M, Work, Love, and Life When Robots Rule the Earth. And James may accept some of the premises, but certainly not some of the conclusions, which we'll get to. But why don't we start at the beginning here with the things we agree about. James, is social science useful in studying the future?
I certainly think so. I mean, my training is as a sociologist, and I was, I was never really a Marxist, but I always believed in some of the premises of Marxism that technological evolution set the parameters for social evolution, which I think is one of the things that we agree about, that the different modes of production in different historical periods tend towards one kind of social order or another. But I guess one of the things that we can talk about is the degree to which those parameters are tight or broad. And I guess I have a somewhat broader and less predictive model. And part of that has been the influence of drinking from the pipe of technological innovation over the last 25, 30 years, the news about technological innovation, and becoming increasingly convinced of the chaotic nature of the future, as Charlie Strauss said, that the singularity is the turd in the fruit bowl, the punch bowl of science fiction and futurism, because if there really is this point in the future beyond which everything becomes unpredictable, then a lot of our speculations about scenarios become pointless. But I agree with your general premise, and want to hear you expound a little bit more on it, that insofar as there are rules in social order, that we should attempt to think about how things will play out in the future. And I certainly agree with that general premise.
Right. So you and I agree that there are a number of technologies coming up that are foreseeable in the sense that they're at least plausibly technologies that we will have to encounter in the next century or so at least. And that it's possible to foresee future technologies. So we share then, contact with technologists of various sorts who try to think about their technology and try to foresee its outlines. Many of those technologists, I think, don't believe social science exists. So when they get to thinking about the consequences of those technologies, they throw up their hands and look to science fiction or their own intuition or whatever, because they don't think there's really anything else you can do. And you and I, having spent decades studying social science, I think will testify that social science does exist. It can tell you more than the raw speculations or intuitions of a social science of a technologist. And that's one of the things we can bring to bear, is to talk about likely, perhaps, or at least more likely than other social consequences of various technologies. That is, we can make weak predictions, or at least conditional predictions, about if a certain technology shows up. How would that change the social order? How would that change law, politics, industry, work, etc.? And of course, the future isn't completely determined by these things, and there's a lot of noise in our predictions. Nevertheless, we can do a lot better by trying than not trying. And as you say, we may disagree somewhat on how open the future is. So you talked a bit about a lot of technologies that have been coming, being chaotic. That is, you might not have foreseen which technologies would show up when. Kevin Kelly, I think, has argued that most of the technologies that have shown up haven't really been under collective control or social control. That is, when some more local group decided that the technology was in their interest to introduce, then it happened, and if other customers liked it, it spread. And nobody's been driving the train in technology for a long time. That is, the world hasn't had great convocations where we think far ahead and decide which technologies we want and then make those happen and the others not happen. Mostly technology has just shown up and we've been dealing with it, and that's been history for tens of thousands of years. What do you think?
Oh, I agree with that. Yeah, I think there is a certain. It's obvious that there's no conspiracy in human history about which technologies appear when, and or the consequences that they wreak on society. I guess, and to that extent, I have bought into some of Kurzweilian techno-determinism, the notion that there is an accelerating trend. The strategy I adopted when I wrote Citizen Cyborg was to say, if we're interested in trying to spell out some of the social policy questions that we're going to have to confront, is it useful to come up with a strong techno-determinist timeline of this is going to happen in 2025 and this is going to happen in 2035? Or is it more useful, which is the strategy I adopted, which is to say the things that we're most likely to try to accomplish, because we've already been trying to accomplish them for a long time, are things like making ourselves happier, making ourselves smarter, making ourselves more productive, and so forth. And it's very likely that we're going to get better and better at those things. And if we get better and better at those things, no matter how we get there with gene therapies and nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, whatever, what would the consequences of being really good at those things be? And so that kind of speculation, I think, is at least for the proximate, next 50 years, a reasonable way to proceed. How weird things get after that, I think, is one of the questions that I know the critics of your work and certainly the critics of mine have said.
So I agree that there's a lot of technology that's coming around that won't radically change society. That is, there's a sense in which we can reason about higher level, large scale social issues and be somewhat robust to a lot of smaller technical changes. We can sort of roughly see growing, increasing wealth and a number of trends we expect to continue, i.e. decreasing fertility, decreasing work hours, etc. And it's appropriate to think about those trends and how we can adapt to it, even if we don't predict the next iteration of social media or something like that, right? Um,
Right,
but on the other hand, there are some large disruptions that if they were to come up, they would substantially change the terms of the analysis for many of these bigger social issues. And so it makes more sense to think about those if you're going to try to be more robust in your social analysis because they could change the ground rules. Um,
right.
and so
So one of the examples I think we both agree on is that the accelerating trends in technology, whatever they might be. You have a fairly specific version of what those trends might be. I'm a little bit more open about it, but I think the acceleration of technology is probably going to have a technological unemployment effect. That is, in the pace at which labor markets, skills, education, and so forth would be able to adapt to the rapid erosion of human labor is going to make it very difficult for a lot of people to find work for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And as a consequence, we're going to have some big political economic adaptations. And I think we both agree about that.
well,
And that's a good starting point.
I don't agree that anything is different now. That is, we've seen increasing automation for several centuries, and we've had a relatively steady rate of job displacement. We've had a burst of improvement of automation. And I think our current era of automation is a burst in line with the burst we've seen before, so it doesn't really support the this time is different claim. Uh, but I do agree that eventually there will be a time where this time is different. And it's well worth thinking ahead of time about how to prepare for that, even if right now isn't that time. So I don't actually see that much change in the next 20 years compared to the last century in terms of automation and displacing jobs. But I do think it's something we should think about well ahead of time, because when it does come, it may come fast and it may be too late then to respond if you haven't thought about it ahead of time.
Well, not to take anything away from the Obama recovery, which, like the Clinton recovery, was relatively robust, but there has been a decline since 2000 in the proportion of the U.S. population in paid employment, the labor force participation rate. Most of that has to do with the retirement of the first wave of baby boomers. But I think we would need to basically add 200,000 jobs per month in order to keep up with population growth if we wanted to not have that labor force participation rate decline. We haven't been doing that since 2008, only occasionally.
I'm sure really, I'm
Um,
happy to admit there's lots of, fluctuations and changes in labor markets that are worth attending to, and there has been a decline in labor force participation and a decline in the labor share of income. These are, and trends that people
right.
pay a lot of attention to. I just think automation is a relatively minor contribution. There's a whole bunch of other things that are contributing to these trends.
I agree, certainly at this point. And as you say, it's hard to predict exactly when these robotics, automation, 3D printing, and those kinds of things might kick in as causes of the erosion of labor. But I've been delighted with the growth of recognition, even to the point where Obama's head of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, Jason Furman, he wrote a piece this summer abusing the idea of technological unemployment and basic income. And so when the pinnacle of economic policy thinkers in the country begin to get serious about attacking the idea, I think it's the serious discussion has begun.
Right. So the way I would think about the future is by a comparison to the past. I'd say the future is more important than the past, but we study the future a lot less. The main reason people say we can't study the future is because we don't have artifacts like we do about the past, fossils, etc. But I think we can study the future if we're willing to break it down by disruptive scenario. That is, in the short term, you can just study trends projecting forward, but you do expect various technologies to break those trends. And the question is which technologies will break them when, and it is really hard to put together a map of the entire sequence and what would happen when. That's crazy. But you could break the future into scenarios like which is the really big disruption that happens first.
Mm-hmm.
Because then we could sensibly talk about that. And if the future is important enough to have 100 books, it's important to have, it's worth having books on scenarios that only have a 1% chance. So I'm happy to, you know, work on scenarios one at a time that have a 1% chance and just try to fill out a map of the future in terms of what big disruptive technologies might show up that we should think about. So I think of my book in that spirit of saying I pick for that book a claim about what would be the most disruptive technology, i.e. the really big thing that changes the rules in a great many areas. If that's the first thing that shows up that way, then you have a chance of envisioning how that might play out. And I chose brain emulations as my particular scenario, and I don't think it's a crazy one in terms of something that might plausibly happen, and certainly seems big enough, but I'm happy to admit
That,
there are a number of other scenarios that should also be explored.
and I think this is one of I don't know how many of these kinds of conversations you've had, but you and I have known each other for 25 years and run in the same futurist circles, and probably you haven't had interlocutors very often who agree with the basic premise that brain emulation is going to be possible and very likely seen in this century. I do agree with that premise. I guess part of my assumption about how that is going to play out, because of the dynamic nature of consciousness, I imagine that the kind of Kurzweilian scenario of nano neural interfaces and nano robotics will have to be entrained in brains over years, and if not decades, in order to achieve the kind of emulation that we're talking about. And that as a consequence, we're talking about a future in which human consciousness really becomes melded with the exocortex of computing. And so one of the reasons why I'm skeptical about the scenario that you've outlined is that I see a scenario where meat brains extending themselves through AI and computing tools that are basically slaved to the core personal identity of meat brains is a more likely scenario than one where we happily acknowledge the rights and autonomy of virtual persons. Now, you and I have a friend, Martine Rothblatt, who has given a great deal of thought to the legal and policy consequences of creating entirely autonomous virtual persons. And I do think that that will eventually occur, but I think it's, just to get there, we need to have the kind of AI in our brain which makes us not just going to be humans 1.0 that get shuffled off to the farm while the actual virtual workers do all the work, as you have imagined.
So I imagine that many of these technologies will become feasible, but as an economist, I will focus more on costs and say, if several technologies were feasible and one of them were just much more attractive, then it would tend to dominate unless there were strong social pressures to resist it. So if we had hardware added to existing human brains to augment it, and that was effective, and that hardware could then produce things like emulations that were wholly detached from human brains, then those wholly detached versions would have enormous cost and speed advantages. You really couldn't run the human brain faster with augmentations. It would still have to run at pretty much the same speed. It would still have pretty much the same cost limitations, i.e. you have to grow humans up from childhood. It takes decades. They're fragile and expensive. And so if you could have emulations and human augmentation, it seems to me the emulations just win hands down in terms of economic competition. So then the question would be, would such competition be allowed?
Right. And I think, your idea that eventually there might be virtual persons that have rights, property rights, rights to own themselves, basically, is legitimate. I think, beyond that, it's very hard to predict what kind of society they would create or we would create with them. Um, but yeah, we agree about the basic premise of brain emulation and the eventual creation of virtual persons.
Well, so apparently we disagree on some things, so we should try to get to the bottom of those and explore them, even acknowledging the various agreements we have, which is great. So, uh, at some level, I guess I would go back to analogies of the past and ask if foragers had foreseen the possibility of farming and could have talked about it and thought about what to do about it, could they have really substantially changed the outlines of the farming world, or was that pretty much predetermined by the technology and their basic abilities? Similarly, for an industry, if people 1,000 or 2,000 years ago had been informed about the basic outline of what an industrial civilization might plausibly look like, and they could have thought about how they wanted it to be different, could they have substantially changed it? Another way to ask is often these eras, these modes of production, as you say, different lifestyles and attitudes went with them, different whole ways of thinking about the world, and apparently the previous ways gave way to the new ways, even when the people who adopted the previous ways weren't too much in favor of that. They often opposed and thought the new ways were evil and bad ways of thinking, yet the new ways won out. Um, was that an accident? Could they have prevented that? And if not, is it new and different now? Do we have more abilities to change sort of what world and attitudes would go with a new mode of production than our ancestors in the farming and foraging worlds had?
Well, I certainly think that our capacity for foresight is superior to our hunter-gatherer ancestors or industrial ancestors or whatever, farming.
Oh, sure. This is about our capacity to do something with the foresight. uh,
Right. That I'm not so sure of, and I think that the problem, if you look at the actual historical record, as I said, I think the parameters of what a hunter-gatherer mode of production does to a culture or politics are extremely broad. That you had
oh, sure.
Pacific cultures, you had warlike cultures, you had matriarchal, you had patriarchal, you had all kinds of things.
Oh, sure.
And the same is true for industrial society. I mean, we had the Third Reich, and we had everything in between. So I don't think that just saying that we're going to end up with certain kinds of technology tells us what kinds of politics or culture or psychology we're necessarily going to end up with, and probably we'll have quite a variety. Unless there's a singleton, unless there's some kind of dominant monoculture, we may end up with quite a variety of adaptations in the future.
It's obvious we had a lot of variety of forager cultures, and we had a lot of variety of farming cultures, and we've had a lot of variety of industrial cultures. Nevertheless, surely those distributions really look quite different, right? I mean, we certainly see a lot of things in common that each of these eras share that distinguish themselves from the other eras. So we can both see some parameters on which a lot of variation is possible, and other parameters on which relatively little variation exists.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. I mean, one of the reasons for my skepticism about some of the scenario that you've drawn is that I've done a lot of writing and thinking about what I call the telos of liberal individualism. In other words, the notion that the Enlightenment basically established the autonomous, discrete, and continuous individual as the fundamental unit of society, and that from my perspective, that's always been a myth or a fiction. It's one that I happily subscribe to, But I think that the emerging neurotechnologies, especially the kind of neurotechnology that would be required for mind uploading, will quickly erode our happy, use of that fiction or that myth. Once we start sharing our memories with each other, once we start having the capacity to fundamentally change our personality, our likes and dislikes, our attributes, I think that we're going to have to come up with some new political, economic, philosophical understanding of the underpinning of our values, because liberal democracy and capitalist democracy just won't work in the same way once we realize that they don't, that the underpinning is false.
But I think in my book I described a world where what you said is true. They have a great many changes in their attitudes about individuality and what are the units of analysis in the social world and what are the units of affiliation and which other creatures they identify with how much. All of that does change a lot in the scenario I described. I guess you're somehow still, though, seeing the scenario described as individualist in a way that you think is less likely.
Well, you talk about people, having just property. I mean, the notion of individuals who own
Well,
things in such a world, or who are attached to corporeal, the various aspects of corporeal existence. I mean, sexuality, family ties, property, work, retirement. You've projected basically it's, and
but
I think this is one of the weaknesses of all kinds of science fictional and social scientific prediction, is that you're basically projecting our current psychology onto a radically different kind of
well,
world.
let's take some of those at least, or one at a time, see how many we can go through and ask how plausible is it that they could change in what sense? So you say work. I mean, work has existed for a long time, of course. Employment has been different in the recent era. Farmers weren't employed so much, neither were foragers, but they all certainly worked. So it's really hard to imagine a future world of any sort where there isn't some sort of work. I mean, stuff has to get done, right?
Oh, I agree. I mean, I think part of our issue here is that the kind of artificial intelligence evolutionary path that I imagine is one in which there isn't that much motivation to create self-willed artificial intelligence, and I see the M world that you describe as basically one of AGIs that have emerged from brains as opposed to from other ways, artificial general intelligences. I don't want my toaster to argue with me. I don't want my fridge to argue with me. I think that yes, there probably will be work. Things will get done. Whether there will be wage labor, whether there will be a labor market, whether there will be private property. I think these are all assumptions about the last 200 years projected on the next.
Well,
And
I mean,
I don't think.
foragers have property. Farmers have property. Now it's a different, legal system and environment, but they certainly have property. Property is an ancient thing, isn't it?
Well, did foragers have property? I mean, basically, the headmen, could take what they wanted.
Well,
I
I
mean,
mean, foragers, that wasn't true. Foragers were very egalitarian and they shared a lot, but
yeah,
certainly, yeah, individuals had some degrees of property. You had your clothes or your bow and arrow, or things like that. There was personal property. There was also communal property. There were things that we together as a group had. That's still a kind of property. It's less an individual property, perhaps is what you meant. But you can imagine a larger units having property. As long as there have been nations and groups, those groups have had various kinds of things they thought were theirs, and they were adamant about that with respect to neighboring groups. I mean, perhaps you're reading more into my words than I intend in terms of I'm just trying to talk about these robust general features that we've seen for all the eras so far, in terms of there being, base. You talked about sexuality. I mean, sexuality has existed for a long time too. Uh, in the M
but
world, there's less use for it. I mainly forecast
if
that it
if
continues
if
because it's possible and people probably can't change that much. But
if one of our 200,000 year ago ancestors were to pop up today, they would need to be enculturated. But biologically, they have basically the same neural architecture that we are walking around with today. And I think once we imagine the complete transcending of the meat, that we're talking about a very different scenario. Basically, I imagine that the capacities for neural or cognitive architecture, personality architecture in purely virtual personalities is extremely broad, broader than we can currently imagine. But that one of the first things that we're going to be concerned about, and that we are already beginning to be concerned about, is its autonomy and the threats that that autonomy of those virtual creations would have vis-a-vis our interests as embodied beings. And so I think we're going to basically have a strong legal, political, criminal restriction or regulation of the creation of truly self-willed virtual beings. I think there's going to be a very different attitude about using extensions, artificial intelligences, personal assistants, emulations of one's own personality that are in some sense enslaved to the central core personality, but that in the long run, we're going to be very cautious about creating those the kind of virtual persons that you're talking about.
So, correct me if I'm wrong. It seems to me that you are thinking in a context where a number of different artificial intelligence technologies are roughly equally available, and so the legal system has a fair bit of freedom to choose which sorts it prefers, and culture and politics can talk about which forms it prefers and then create rules to make sure the kinds we like are there versus the other kinds we don't like are not, and there's not that much of a cost penalty for choosing one over the other. The scenario I have in mind, though, is a scenario where emulations become feasible, and then other forms of artificial intelligence at that point just are not yet feasible. They will eventually become feasible. And so at that point, the choice is either to use that form of artificial intelligence or not. And for that sort of choice, there are large productivity and wealth and other sorts of military power penalties for choosing not to use the technology. So in that sort of situation, you might choose to create these emulations even if you have some qualms about the fact that they are autonomous, because there are so many advantages from doing so.
Well, yes, I agree with that general premise, and it's precisely because I don't see an interest of a corporation in basically using the labor of self-willed creatures that have all these carryovers from their corporeal existence, personalities and clans, and a need to have leisure and all these things that you talk about, versus tools that do all the same things, that have all the same skills, but are basically philosophical zombies, don't have any personality of their own, don't have any will of their own or desires of their own. So I see that scenario as far more cost efficient, and far less dangerous for our human future than one where there's all these virtual personalities running around.
Well, I'm happy to discuss the relative dangers, but I just want to get clear about which scenarios we are talking about so that we can at least name them, and then we can start to talk about the relative
Sure.
likelihood and relative nature. But
Philosophical zombie future versus
right. So,
self-willed
so,
personality
so the
future.
question is, could we reach a point where it's mechanically possible to take a brain and emulate it, but at that point we don't understand enough about the architecture and function of modules in the brain to create a philosophical zombie that's useful. And so we either have the choice to use emulations as they are, as mostly black boxes with a modest number of tweaks you can do to them, or to not use them. That's the scenario that I'm taking as the premise of my book, and I'm working out many consequences of that, and I agree it's not the only possible scenario. As I said, I'm happy to examine 100 scenarios that only have a 1% chance, but is that a scenario that you can imagine is coherent as a technology scenario? Again, we talked about technology being somewhat autonomous, that we don't really get to choose the technologies and when they show up in what order, but we mostly have to deal with that. Is this a plausible case we would have to deal with of this technology showing up and the others just not being feasible at that point?
I guess in the abstract, I could say that it's feasible, but I think that the obstacles to creating any plausible emulation of human brains sooner than creating equally and better functional and safer and more, profit-making zombie tools, it seems extremely unlikely to me. So,
Well,
but I think
you're not
the
alone
thing
in
that,
that. There are many other people who have made that criticism of the book, have said that they just don't think the
yeah,
scenario is that likely.
right. And I think, again, we agree about some basics that we can move forward with, which is, the basic conclusion for human beings, whether we get there with tools that take over all human labor, that don't have virtual personalities in their own economy and their own societies, their own cities, and all these things, or we do it the way
Well,
you're talking about.
so let's start that
But
in a minute, but I just want to post a flag post at the moment to make the point that there is an argument for why I think this scenario is likely relative to the other one you're describing, which is that I was an AI researcher for 9 years, 20 years ago, and progress still seems slow overall. And so, as I've said in the book and in my talks, when I've asked people who've been in the field of AI research for at least 20 years, how far have we come in 20 years? They usually say 5 to 10% of the distance to human level abilities with no noticeable acceleration. And that would put us at 2 to 4 centuries, which is slower, it would seem, than the emulation route plausibly could proceed. So that's the basis for suggesting that the emulation route might plausibly happen first. But again, I don't want to put a strong
Robin,
emphasis on the probabilities.
you know that if you talk to people who are attempting whole brain emulation, the European Brain Project, the American brain researchers, that they will give estimates between 100 and 1,000 years that it would take, or never, that it would take us to do what you're talking about. I agree that it's probably going to happen in this century. I just don't think it's going to happen before we have equally functional AI tools. But can we set that aside? Because
Yes, we can.
I think it's, yeah. I mean, I think that the implications of your scenario have as much to do, precisely because you're attempting to extrapolate human historical and sociological facts and truths and trends onto this scenario. It has as much to do and to say to how human beings will, organic human beings will evolve in the future as it does about your scenario. And so I think that that's an interesting part of what you've done.
So a number of the different scenarios of AI, human level AI showing up have a lot of commonality in terms of what happens to the humans, or at least the range of things that could happen to the humans. And that's probably what you'd like to talk more about. Although they differ perhaps substantially in the political regime, in the sense that if philosophical zombie, not autonomous, very subservient, docile AI is the main form of AI that shows up first, it mostly won't be involved in the political disputes. It won't get involved in lobbying for one or the other various political outcomes. It'll mostly be humans of various sorts, and we can just reason about that. But if emulations are the form of artificial intelligence that shows up, we would have to take their participation in these political processes seriously, and that could substantially change the political outcome.
Well, exactly. And if virtual persons were to be granted rights, and Martine Rothblatt has given some substantial thought to this, if they were to be granted rights and, for instance, the suffrage within a democracy, and start copying themselves, our current anxiety about immigrants sneaking across the border so their babies can be born in the United States would pale in comparison to people's anxieties about that future. I don't think liberal democracy, the liberal democracy as we know it won't survive the board. We will have to figure out some new form of governance.
So I think speed-weighted voting can actually work for the M's reasonably well. So they could have something a lot like liberal democracy with speed-weighted voting, but there would be substantial differences mere because of the variance of speeds.
Well, speed-weighted, you mean the slower ones get a stronger vote?
Or less votes. So if you run 10 times as fast, you get 10 times as many votes.
Well, that's basically you're extrapolating, Citizens United into your scenario, that votes are equal to dollars. And I think that it's, that is one thing I think is probably true, is that we will have to continue to deal with the undemocratic influence of disparities of wealth on the political process and the outcomes of the political process, whether it's organic or virtual or some combination of the two. Now you open yourself in the book to the possibility that there might be slavery in the future. There might be various kinds of neo-feudal adaptations that are non-democratic. I see your kind of thoughts about nepotism and clans and so forth to be a kind of neo-feudal caste labor system as opposed to a pure labor market. But the general conclusion that comes out of that is that if we were to ever have the disparities of wealth and power that you imagine in the book, it's not democracy anymore. It's not one M, one vote, or one human, one vote. It's some new neo-feudal social order, and it's something different.
Well, I mean, democracy in the farming era was something different than democracy in the industrial era, and forager democracy was different. So I would say each era would have to have its own somewhat different form of democracy, because, political systems need to reflect a lot of the details of the societies they live in. Um,
And on that we agree. And I think that that's one of the interesting things to think about is how a future in which radical technological innovations change the distribution of wealth and power. So, as a bioethicist, I'm frequently asked about the inequitable outcomes of things like cognitive enhancement. And I say, look, if we invent a pill that costs $1 million and it makes you a million times smarter so that you can become a Lex Luthor type world ruling supervillain, then it's basically in the same category as a nuclear weapon. And we don't allow just anybody to have nuclear weapons, although we have, unfortunately, quote, allowed North Korea and some madmen to have nuclear weapons. But we're really worried about that. And we will have to have policies in the future for the regulation of the proliferation of technologies that create vast disparities of wealth and power between citizens, because
well,
they're a fundamental existential threat to both the world and the outcomes of democratic
Well,
societies.
let's go through that a little slower. I mean, this sounds like an interesting topic. I mean, I think from our previous conversations, you are especially focused on inequality and the consequences of inequality and the things that could cause inequality. And there are, in fact, many ways over the years in which technology and other social innovation has augmented the ability to sustain inequality, or the various kinds of inequality that are possible. That is, foragers can only be unequal in a limited number of ways. Some of them are stronger, some of them are wittier, but they're mostly on their own to do that. The sorts of things we've acquired over the intervening, tens of thousands of years have allowed some people to be different than others in more ways, right? We have organizations and somebody can be at the top of it. We have machines and somebody can own a big machine. We have medicine and some people can buy better medicine. So just generically over time, technology has allowed more kinds of and more degrees of inequality. Isn't that roughly right?
Yeah, and I think one of the things I'm worried about and thinking a lot about is that the Enlightenment basically proposed, that all men are created equal, or the notion that at least at some fundamental level, there should be a rough political and juridical equality between human beings, um, and that these technologies and the rapid evolution of our societies may threaten that. And in bioethics, we've started to talk about post persons, or the creation of enhanced human beings who might no longer feel that they are beholden. And I think there's already these people in the world, but and I think racism is a part expression of this. But anyway, that we may actually create the X-Men super beings who no longer feel that human equality has any meaning for them.
So
I think
I,
that is an existential threat to
I don't
humanity.
see it nearly as an existential threat. I definitely see that many people are uncomfortable with inequality and would like to reduce it. And if they have enough political power, they could enact policies that do achieve that. But I don't see that societies with substantially more inequality are, in fact, on average, more at risk of becoming extinct. That seems to me, mostly a side issue. Uh, I'd be interested in your reaction to my sort of overall account for the trend in
Well,
attitudes toward
let's just go
inequality.
back to the inequality part, because one of the things that you put a great emphasis on in your book is the relationship between different forms of social governance and productivity and the growth of GDP. And the World Bank has been relatively clear that growing global inequality and inequality within countries, it has been a huge drag on GDP, and that if we want more growth in the future, that we have to create redistributional regimes that ensure general prosperity.
I'm happy to grant that there seem to be some correlations between inequality and growth. I haven't looked at those in detail, and if causal, they indicate some support for some mild degree of reduced inequality. But the fact that you should fear people who could like become very rich isn't really, implied by that. It's there just be some more overall rationale for reduced inequality if in fact these correlations are causal.
Well, let's think about what the consequences of really, really rich are. I mean, Russian kleptocracy. Do you think Russia might be a little bit more productive if, there was a little bit more trust busting going on in their oil industry? If the state had a little bit less kleptocratic control of industry. I think, our regime of relatively distributed capitalism was more productive precisely because it reduced the kleptocratic concentration of wealth and power. Now, from a Marxian point of view, the concentration of wealth and power dialectically produces a demand for its socialization, which is, I think, the other part of this equation that, I don't think it's certain. I'm no longer an historical determinist, but I think that there will be a growing pressure, growing political calls for the socialization of concentrated wealth and power. So the extent to which we do, in fact, see the kinds of wealth and power concentration that you imagine, I think it's going to create an equal and opposite reaction for democratization and socialization.
So I think one thing that futurists can contribute to the larger world, including the discussion of inequality, is to help people realize that there are much larger dimensions and spaces of inequality possible than people have so far been thinking of. And so the usual debate about inequality is actually within a relatively narrow range of kinds of inequality, and policies that might be appropriate for that may not do very much for other forms. So, for example, most discussions of inequality in our time and age are about inequality between the average income of families within a nation. That is, they aren't very interested in inequality within families, not much inequality interested in inequality between nations, not much interested in inequality at different points in time, certainly not between different species, not much interested in non-financial inequality such as wit or sexual appeal or things like that. So the focus is on one particular kind of inequality. And interestingly, in my M scenario, among the M's, that kind of inequality becomes relatively small, and there are other kinds of inequality that become large that the M's themselves might want to focus on, but we don't have much cultural heritage in dealing with them. So, for example, today, some lineages in terms of a family, say, in the last few hundred years have had many children, and other lineages have had very few children, and we have very little discussion or concern about inequality of that sort. We are mostly take as given the number of people that exist in a family now and just focus on their average income. In the emulation world, most of the inequality that's dramatic compared to our world is of the form of how many descendants any one person has, the size of a lineage. And it's open question to what extent M's would be concerned about that kind of inequality. But again, the larger point is just when you step back and see the larger history of different modes of production and the directions things can go, you realize there are a lot more kinds of inequality than people have been thinking about. And there are many issues other than inequality. That is, there are just a lot of things that happen in the world that matter that we should be thinking about it other than inequality in general and even the specific sort that we usually talk about.
Well, there can't be a mode of production or an economy without a regulatory superstructure. So, in other words, the libertarian or anarchist fantasy that you could have a pure capitalism without a state has never, there's never been one. So
Happy to grant that, sure.
yeah. So within the context of the society that you imagine, you say, well, it may be that they might have certain ideas about equality or they might not. Well, let's say they do. Let's say that they have a legal and political regime with the kind of inequality, as I said, with the kinds of inequality, the levels of inequality of wealth that you've imagined. I don't think any kind of democratic fiction would be sustainable. It's really a neo-feudal regime, and especially one in which because I say these questions about personal identity and personal autonomy will be up for grabs, and you yourself acknowledge that slavery might be one of the outcomes in that scenario. I think it's far more likely that you'd see hegemonic singleton of the kind that Nick Bostrom has thought about emerge or a plurality of singletons of some kind emerge in that scenario. Now, I I don't want to go too far down that road because I don't buy into the fundamentals of the scenario. But I think what I do want to talk a little bit more about is that extrapolating from the experience of the last 200 years of liberal democratic capitalism to the extent that we've had that on to the next 200 years is suspicious for a second two reasons. One is that you've already discussed how the labor market might disappear for human beings. And if there's no labor market, if there's no wage slavery, if there's no necessity to sell your labor for wages, one of the fundamental tenets of contemporary capitalism has disappeared. I talk about that in terms of the expansion of the social wage, that we're going to need to expand free education, free healthcare, and all those things, and eventually have a universal basic income guarantee, which you yourself recently opined should be global. Now, the second thing I think that's of question is whether the inefficiency of the market mechanism as a way of distributing goods in society will persist that much longer, or how it will evolve. In socialist circles, we've discussed this. Hayek and other Western economists have basically argued that there's the socialist calculation problem. It was impossible to have a truly planned economy because there's too many calculations to be made. We know that in the future, and I think we agree that in the future, there's going to be a lot of calculation available. And to the extent that the market mechanism, it creates a certain amount of waste. We see already, for instance, within Walmart, that there's tens of thousands of Walmarts around the world. They invented barcodes. They invented RFID scanners. Their economy, the Walmart economy, is bigger than 150 economies of countries in the world. So within the Walmart economy, you have a functioning planned economy that gets things from A to B using planning as opposed to a strict market mechanism. I think part of the question here is that the fundamental idea that in the future we would necessarily be dependent on the market mechanism for the distribution of goods and services may not be true. Now, I'm not advocating for the elimination of private property. I'm not advocating for the elimination of the right to buy and sell things. I don't want to live in that world. But I think that to the extent that it's more efficient, to the extent that people don't have to work anymore and basically get their stuff, because they're human beings and as citizens, we may be increasingly moving into that more post-capitalist society.
So I'd say that the thing that was the biggest change in the Industrial Revolution was actually the introduction of large organization. The steam engine and those other sorts of things get the credit, but in some sense they're a side effect of new forms of social organization. At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, people were scared because they didn't know where this was going. They imagined that these new large organizations would not just run workplaces, they would run everything. And there were a lot of scary books and scenarios were painted describing how the new large organizations would tell you who to marry and tell you when to eat and where to live and everything. And that seemed like a plausible projection of what they had already seen in the large workplaces and factories that seemed to be becoming dominant then. Now, it's turned out, I think, that we have decided that as we get rich, we're going to spend our wealth on not doing that in our personal lives, but we do have high degrees of regimentation and structure inside our work lives. And our work lives have more of that than our ancestors would have put up with, really. So, we are still in the beginning of large organizations, and there's a long way still to go to learn about how to structure them. So I don't want to make any strong claims about the relative emphasis of organization versus markets in terms of allocating and making choices. I want to be trying to make predictions that are robust to that choice, and I've tried to do that. That is, to the extent that people think large organizations might displace markets, it's often because they think they'd make roughly the same decisions on the key large decisions that need to be made. And so an analysis that just uses ordinary market analysis can be predictive of the outcomes, even if they don't in fact use markets at that point. I mean, there's just standard analysis of efficient outcomes and why those are a good idea and how markets can approach those, but other forms of organization could also approach them if they're done well. And so again, I'm not trying to make strong claims about markets versus other organizations. I'm trying to look to all the other changes that will be happening and make a rough guess about what things will be like. That is, who will work where and what kind of jobs will get done, et cetera. And mostly those don't depend much. So even say the Soviet Union, a classic example of a very non-market economy, it was roughly a recognizable industrial economy because it was competing with other industrial economies. So it had factories, it had specialists, it had cities, it had lots of familiar social organization from our world. So from the year 1000 AD, if you were trying to predict the future, it wouldn't have been such a bad thing to predict the Soviet Union versus New York City. I mean, the differences between those two might have been relatively minor from the point of view of figure out what's going to happen.
Well, they certainly were minor for the participants, since a lot of them preferred one over the other. But yeah, I mean, yeah, the difference is that basically Russians and Americans were both upright hominids, and what we're talking about here is not having a body, not having testicles, not having intestines. And I think in that scenario, the notion that we're already having a debate about human beings, organic human beings' capacity to transcend things like compassion, hatred, to enhance our self-control, all the things that you imagine rapidly evolving in and this is why I think it's partly interesting. So for instance, one of the things that you speculate in the book is about the evolution of personality traits, in that world. And I think you're partly right. And I think we're going to be able to, as organic human beings, we're going to be subject to some of those same evolutionary pressures. And we're going to be able to increasingly do something about our personalities. So, for instance, the fact that people who are happier, there's a bell curve of happiness because of our happiness set points. People who are happier generally achieve more in their lives and in the world. So they get strong social reinforcement for that. So to the extent that we have control over our basic mood in the future, we probably will all tweak it up a little bit to become happier. I don't think we're going to tweak it up as far as our friend David Pierce wants, because then we become land of the lotus eaters. Nobody wants to do anything. But I do think that some of the things that you've thought about in that virtual context will be happening for organic human beings. But I do, again, back to the capitalist point, if we evolve past labor markets, if we evolve past the market mechanism, if we become more like the Borg, that's a very, just to say your basic speculative point is we could have slavery or not, we could have democracy or not, we could be the Borg, or we could be a bunch of individual workers, with citizen rights. That's pretty broad. I don't see that necessarily we come to a lot of strong conclusions out of all that.
Well, I think we have to be opportunistic if we're going to be futurists. So there are
Yeah.
some dimensions that it's going to be hard to predict, and we're going to have to say can't predict that, and other things where we can predict better, we should speak up about those and just be honest that some things are easier to predict than others. So, certainly we just aren't going to predict future music fashion or clothing fashions. We know fashion just varies so much and across such a wide space, we should just give up on predicting future fashions. And similarly, some of these other things like political systems are harder to predict because there's so many different possibilities and they depend so much on local coordination and which groups happen to do what when that you got to say, can't really tell.
Just let me ask you a question about your scenario, which I think gets to some of the anxieties that Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking and our friend Nick Bostrom have about the growth of unequal power, the orthogonal nature of AI minds and their vast amount of power. And that is, if you had AI minds or virtual minds that wanted stuff, and this is the scenario you imagine because they've been extrapolated out of our brains, um, and we continued what we organic human beings had through our stock market, apparently through the manipulation of the stock market. We all own a share of the wealth being produced in these virtual worlds. Why wouldn't these virtual persons eventually say, screw that, I'm taking it back? I mean, why wouldn't they expropriate the human beings in a relatively short order?
Well, so this comes down to the key thing about timescale. So often when people talk about the future, they sort of munge together all the different future eras as if it was all one place. And it's important to distinguish different possible future eras. So my ambition is only to talk about the next era after ours that's as different from ours as ours is from farming and foraging. And my baseline forecast is in this next era, it only lasts a year or two in objective time. To the emulations, they're running roughly 1,000 times human speed, so they experience millennia. To the humans on the outside, they only experience a year or two, so not much happens for them.
Let's just rewind
So
that for a second because I'm not sure everyone caught that. Your book is about what's going to happen in the first year after this emulated world gets created. That's
Right.
right.
And then after that, I'm not telling you what happens. So I am explicitly saying I'm only going to predict one next era and not the whole future after that. And I am saying, I have a place a limit on how far I'm going to forecast here. So yes,
So for human beings, if we can guarantee that we all own a piece of this virtual wealth, and if we can, or we can create a universal basic income or whatever, you can guarantee that for 1 year,
I'm not even going to guarantee it for then. I'm going
you're
to
not
say,
even going to guarantee it.
I'm just going to
You're just
say
going to
there's
say,
a plausible case that just
maybe.
like today, we don't kill all the retirees and take their stuff. The M's might not kill all the humans and take their stuff, but that's not guaranteed at all. No. But that's
Uh,
again, my working scenario here is I'm not trying to tell you a scenario I think you should embrace or love or hate. I'm just trying to tell you my baseline analysis of what's likely to happen if we do the least to change it. So that may well motivate you to want to change it somehow. Great.
well,
Then I've been helpful and useful, but still,
if
it
you
seems
were a
my job
foreign
is first to describe what
policy,
happens.
if you were a foreign policy consultant and you said if the U.S. does X, there's a 20% chance that all life on Earth would be destroyed. I think the majority of people's conclusion would be, let's not do that. Right?
So,
Let's figure out how not to do that. And I
so
think
James,
to the extent that
this is the
you've come
yes.
up with a useful extrapolation, it's that precisely we don't want to go there.
To the extent that the future embodies accelerating change, this is a robust feature of the future. That is, the faster change gets in the future, the less into the future you can offer any sort of assurances about what will or won't happen. That's not just specific to my scenario. It's a feature of any scenario that has more rapid change than the world you see around you.
Right. And so as I've said to you in the past, I have, because of the unpredictability, the chaotic nature of a change, and my skepticism about historical determinism, I'm increasingly, convinced of the logic of what most futurists do, which is to create scenarios and to say, given these scenarios, here's the steps that we need to take, the proactive steps that we need to take in order to ensure we end up in one versus another. I don't find
But
it, I don't think that it's
sure,
necessary
that,
that we're going to end up with universal basic income, but it's a hell of a lot better than the alternative. And I don't think it's necessary that we're all going to end up equal and democratic, but it's a hell of a lot better than the alternative. So,
I have no objection to thinking through policies and proposing them and trying to work on them. But
right.
I do want these policies to be robust to the scenarios that we envision. So if you say basic income looks like a good idea, then I want to say, well, think through how basic income plays out in some scenarios and ask how well that works. And so, for example, one feature of my book scenario that might happen in many other scenarios is that a new era shows up very suddenly, and there's very rapid growth in this new era, and is not geographically spread out across the earth. It's quite unequally distributed. And so if you have a basic income funded out of some geographically local support, it may not do you much good against that sort of a risk. So if you want a basic income to protect you against that sort of sudden and geographically highly unequal risk, you will need a basic income that's very based on a very broad geographic base of world income.
Oh, we absolutely agree. I mean, I'm a global social democrat. I've been a world federalist since I was 16 or something. And I think one of the questions is how we build increasingly strong transnational institutions that can do things like enact global taxation, global environmental regulation, global security assurance, and eventually establish global worker protections and global, social services and basic income. We're not moving very fast in that direction. I think the growth of Chinese authoritarianism, the growth of Russia as a
Right.
neo-fascist threat, all these things have set back some optimism
So
about our rapid
so
evolution.
although you'd like to do these larger
Yeah.
political things, actually at an individual level, it's more feasible to advise individuals, try to make sure you have very broad-based global assets in your portfolio that might protect you against these sorts of
Well, but
disruptions.
you know that only 20% of Americans are sufficiently invested in the stock market to have
Yes,
any
I
kind
do.
of income security. So
So we can advise
e-
them as well. We can say,
even
hey,
if
this
you
is a
want,
issue, deal with it.
yeah, even if you want an ownership society like the New America Foundation has been proposing for some time, we would need to have policies that redistribute wealth and mandate public investment in these kinds of funds. Now, personally, given the stock market performance after 2008, a lot of these assurances, well, if we just start privatizing Social Security and forcing you all to invest in the stock market, you're all going to be that much more secure in the future. Most people don't buy that, and I think they're right. So I think it's precisely through state mechanisms that we ensure Social Security in the future, and through the redistribution of state mechanisms. Now, public ownership of stock, the California public pension plans are worth something like $1 trillion, and if those public pension plans, there was it Gingrich? Somebody proposed that X amount of Social Security be invested in the stock market instead, and without realizing that if we actually did start to invest that amount in the stock market, the U.S. would have become the U.S. government would have become the majority owner of the U.S. stock market within about 20 years.
Sure.
That doesn't sound like a bad outcome to me, right? So, if you want to socialize the wealth,
Right.
we have to start talking about actual public policy that does that, and not just say
Right.
we need to exhort all these, 80% of people who can't find the resources to invest in,
Right.
a pot to piss in, that they are going to suddenly start investing in the stock market.
So I don't disagree with these things you're saying, particularly in this context. The main stance I want to take is to distinguish my role as a neutral analyst trying to tell people what's likely to happen from my recommendation.
You are not a neutral analyst. The idea of your neutrality is part of the problem with your whole perspective, is that you have all these unexamined assumptions about the way that things should and can be in the future that cloud your predictive scenario. I mean,
which is why I'm eager to talk to people like you. I'm eager to talk to people like you to help me examine my unexamined assumptions. That's why I want to have these conversations.
But the thing is, you're smart enough to be self-contradictory, because you say, I think it's going to be like X, but it could be Y, it could be Z. Who really knows? You say those both things at the same time, and that's what's so frustrating, is that yes, we could end up the Borg, we could end up ants, we could end up something else, but I think it's really going to be like this. We're going to be a little bit more religious. We're going to be a little bit. Why?
Right.
Why?
Well, I mean, often when there's a distribution of possibilities, you want to indicate both the width of the distribution and the middle of the distribution. You want to show that there's a wide range of options possible and roughly where the center of the distribution is, so people have some idea what you're talking about. Those are useful things to do when there's a range of possibilities. So I want to tell you my best guess and tell you don't take that a wide range of things around that are also possible.
And complexity theory turns the idea that there's any kind of predictive capacity of a modal or a bell curve outcome of the future is very unlikely. There are strange attractors, there's black swan events, there's chaotic events that are going to create all kinds of unpredictability about the events in the future. We've reached an hour, Robert.
We have, and it's been fun. And maybe if our listeners beg us, we would do this again, but we'll have to wait for that.
Absolutely.
It's been great talking to you, James.
You as well. Delight.
I hope. Take care. We'll hope we talk again soon.
Absolutely.
Take care. Bye.